The sound woke him before the light did. A low, wet crunch, rubber grinding into soil that should have been firm. Mark Ellison lay still in bed, eyes open, counting the seconds it took for the noise to fade. The house settled around him, the familiar pops and sighs of cooling drywall. Somewhere outside, an engine idled, then cut. He didn't move right away. He had learned not to. Mornings had rules now. Breathe first, sit second, stand only when the room stopped tilting. Cancer had taken its leave 2 years ago, but it had left furniture behind. When he finally swung his legs over the side of the bed, the soles of his feet met cold tile. He dressed without turning on the lights. The clock on the microwave glowed 6:02. He made coffee strong enough to hurt and carried the mug to the front window. The lawn was still in shadow, the early desert sky pale and undecided. At first glance, everything looked the way it should, trimmed edges, even color, no toys, no flags, no signs of life. Then the sun climbed another inch and the damage surfaced. 2 parallel trenches cut through the eastern edge of the grass, deep enough to catch shadow. The soil had collapsed inward, dark and wet, like a wound that hadn't decided whether to bleed or scar. A fine mist hung in the air where the irrigation line had ruptured, spraying uselessly into the morning. Mark didn't swear. He set the mug down carefully, as if the table might crack under sudden movement. He slipped on his shoes and stepped outside. The ground gave way under his weight near the trenches, sucking slightly at his sole. He crouched and brushed aside the grass with 2 fingers. The plastic irrigation pipe had split cleanly, the break white and sharp. He knew exactly where it ran. He'd installed it himself, sweating through chemo-induced chills, his wife seated in a lawn chair with a clipboard, pretending to supervise. Across the street, a pearl-white SUV sat at the curb, angled just enough to look accidental. The hood was still warm. Mark could tell from the way the heat shimmered faintly above it, like breath in reverse. The driver's door opened. Diane Kessler stepped out wearing pressed slacks and a fitted jacket the color of sand. Her hair was perfect in the way that required effort to look effortless. She held a travel mug identical to Mark, except hers had a logo printed on it, HOA branding, tasteful and understated. "Morning, Mark," she said, as if they were neighbors meeting on a walking trail instead of combatants circling a line, neither acknowledged aloud. He stood slowly, straightening his back until the ache settled into something manageable. "You're on my lawn." She smiled, a small professional curve that never reached her eyes. "I'm adjacent to it." She glanced down at the ground, then back up, eyebrows knitting in polite concern. "You know this strip is considered common access grass. It's in the bylaws." "It's on my survey." "I've seen your survey." She took a sip of coffee. "I've also seen the HOA." Mark looked at the trenches again, water pooled around his shoe. "You broke my irrigation." She followed his gaze, nodding thoughtfully. "It does look uneven. You might want to address that before inspection season." The word hung between them, heavier than it deserved to be. "You parked here last night," he said. "I conduct compliance checks after dark," she replied easily. "It's cooler, less disruptive." He waited for her to acknowledge the obvious. She didn't. "Please don't park on my lawn," he said. She tilted her head, studying him as if he were a form filled out incorrectly. "I'll make a note of your concern." She walked back to her SUV, heels clicking softly on asphalt, and drove away without looking back. By noon, the email arrived. The subject line was neutral, almost friendly, "Notice of violation, property maintenance." Mark read it standing at the kitchen counter, the laptop open beside a stack of printed surveys and receipts. The violation cited damage to common area grass and improper irrigation maintenance. The timestamp was 8:14 a.m., nearly an hour before he'd stepped outside. He laughed once, quietly, the sound surprising him. It came out wrong, thin and dry. The fine was modest, the kind designed to feel reasonable. Reasonable fines grew, reasonable fines turned into reasonable liens. He knew the progression. He'd engineered systems for a living. Pressure didn't need to be dramatic to be fatal, it just had to be consistent. He replied with photos attached. Wide shots, close-ups, the SUV's tire tracks aligned perfectly with the damage. He included his survey, highlighted in yellow. He kept the language precise, unemotional. An hour later, the HOA portal showed his complaint as resolved. Nothing had changed. That afternoon, he repaired the irrigation line with hands that still remembered how. The sun baked his neck and sweat strung his eyes. He worked methodically, cutting away damaged plastic, fitting new connectors. He tamped the soil back into place, reseated the sod, and stood back. From a distance, the lawn looked almost untouched. At dusk, he watered lightly, watching the spray pattern arc cleanly across the grass. He thought of his wife again, the way she used to time him, pretending the stopwatch mattered. At 9:47 p.m., headlights swept across his living room. He didn't get up right away. He stayed on the couch, the television muted, the remote heavy in his hand. Outside, the engine idled. He counted the seconds, 10, 20, 30. The crunch came again. This time, he stood. Diane's SUV sat deeper than before, the front tire fully on the lawn now, compressing the fresh soil. The grass flattened obediently beneath the weight. Mark stepped onto the porch. She rolled down the window. "Evening," she said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You're on my lawn," he said. Her eyes flicked to the tire, then back to his face. "It's just temporary. So is the damage." She smiled again, softer this time, almost pitying. "Mark, I'd hate for this to become adversarial." He felt something shift then, a small internal adjustment, like a beam settling into place. He understood suddenly that the lawn wasn't the point. It never had been. "I filed a complaint," he said. "And I reviewed it," she replied. "The board agrees with my assessment." "You're the board." She didn't deny it. "I'm a member of it." "You're targeting me." She studied him for a long moment, the smile fading into something more honest. "You're non-compliant." "With what?" "With the way things work." The engine continued to idle, the headlights bright and impersonal. Somewhere down the street, a garage door opened and closed. Life went on. "If you have concerns," Diane said, "there's a meeting next week. And until then." She shrugged, a gesture that managed to be both casual and absolute. "I'll continue my patrols." She rolled the window up. Mark stood on his porch long after the taillights disappeared, listening to the faint hiss of water escaping underground. The night air smelled of damp soil and cut grass. He looked down at the edge of his lawn, the place he had rebuilt with care, with memory, with stubborn faith that effort mattered. Inside, his phone buzzed. Another email, another notice, another fine. He turned off the porch light and went back inside, closing the door gently behind him. Mark learned the rhythm of disappearance. It wasn't dramatic. There was no red error message or spinning icon. Things simply went from present to absent, the way a chair looks solid until you try to sit in it and find the leg gone. On Monday morning, his complaint still sat in the HOA portal, time-stamped and marked under review. By Tuesday afternoon, it had migrated to closed, with no explanation attached. The photos he'd uploaded were gone. The PDF of his survey remained, but the highlighted section had reverted to grayscale, the emphasis erased without erasing the document itself. He refreshed the page twice, then took screenshots of the absence. Old habit. Engineers trusted data, but they trusted redundancy more. He tried again, submitting a new complaint, this time shorter. Fewer words, less room to be misunderstood. He attached the same photos, renamed. Within an hour, the portal sent an automated reply thanking him for his patience. At lunch, the complaint vanished. Mark pushed his chair back from the desk and stood, letting the blood redistribute. He stared at the wall where his wife's watercolor used to hang before he packed it away. Desert hills, simplified into broad strokes. She painted it during one of his better weeks, the chemo not yet stripping the color from her jokes. He logged out and drove. The HOA office occupied a converted storefront between a nail salon and a tax preparer. The sign outside read Community Management, SERVICES, in serif font that implied both permanence and mercy. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and burnt coffee. The receptionist smiled too quickly. "Can I help you?" "I filed a complaint," Mark said. "It keeps closing itself." She typed his name, nails clicking, her smile thinned. "It shows resolved." "By whom?" She glanced toward the hallway, then back at him. "The board." "When?" Her eyes flicked down. "Yesterday. At 8:14. Her fingers stilled. "That's what it says." "I was asleep at 8:14. She hesitated, then stood. "Let me get someone." A man emerged from the hallway wearing a tie that had lost its argument with the iron. He introduced himself as Caleb, said his role involved coordination. He listened without interrupting, nodding at intervals that suggested agreement without commitment. "You understand," Caleb said finally, "that the board has discretionary authority." "I understand how authority works," Mark replied. "I'm asking how time works." Caleb smiled, relieved at the opening. Sometimes system timestamps can be misleading. "Only in one direction." The smile froze. "I'll look into it." Mark left with nothing resolved and a vague promise that tasted like dust. That afternoon, he noticed the RV. It sat 3 houses down, parked squarely on the street, its faded decals advertising a road trip that had ended years ago. The tires were flat. The registration sticker had expired in a previous administration. Mark checked the bylaws when he got home. Recreational vehicles were prohibited from street parking longer than 72 hours. The RV had been there for months. He took photos, not to report it yet, but to understand the shape of the fence. Rules, like structures, revealed their load-bearing elements when stressed. On Wednesday, a letter arrived by certified mail. The envelope was thick, the paper inside heavy. The language was formal, the tone regretful. Continued violations, it said, could result in additional fines, liens, or further action. Mark traced the embossed HOA seal with his thumb, feeling the raised edge catch. At the bottom, Diane's signature bloomed in blue ink, confident and round. He drove to Juniper Lane that evening, parking across from a small stucco house with peeling trim. He knocked twice before a woman answered, her expression guarded until she recognized him. "You're the one with the lawn," she said. "I'm Mark." She hesitated, then opened the door wider. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old books. Boxes were stacked neatly against one wall, labeled in careful handwriting. "They took it," she said before he could ask. "The house said I owed more than it was worth." "Did you?" She laughed, a short sound that ended abruptly. "No, but it grew." She told him about the notices, the fines doubling, the inspections that found new violations every week. About Diane's visits, always polite, always helpful, offering solutions that involved signatures. "I didn't fight," the woman said. "My husband died here. I didn't have the energy." Mark listened, hands folded, feeling the weight of her words settle somewhere behind his sternum. On the way home, his phone buzzed. Another notice, another fine, this one cited hostile behavior toward board members. He laughed then, the sound echoing inside the car. He wondered how hostility was measured. Decibels, facial expressions, persistence. Thursday night, the board met. Mark arrived early, taking a seat in the back. The room filled slowly, neighbors avoiding his eyes, conversations hushed. Diane sat at the front, papers arranged with geometric precision. When she spoke, the room quieted instinctively. They discussed landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, holiday decorations. Each item approved unanimously. When public comment opened, Mark stood. "I'd like to address the repeated trespass onto my property," he said. Diane didn't look at him. "Please keep remarks under 2 minutes." He held up his survey. "This delineates my boundary. The tire damage aligns." "Your time is up," she said gently. I've been fined for damage caused by. Please sit down. He didn't. She finally met his gaze, her eyes flat. Mark, this meeting isn't the place. Where is? A murmur rippled through the room. Diane raised a hand, and it stilled. We'll review your concerns offline, she said, moving on. The vote passed. The next item appeared on the agenda, authorization for enforcement actions. Mark recognized the phrasing. It was a door with no handle on his side. That night, Diane parked again. Deeper this time. The tire crushed the repaired irrigation line with surgical precision. Mark watched from the window, his reflection faintly superimposed over the scene, two versions of himself occupying the same space. He didn't go outside. He documented photos, video. He noted the time, the angle, the way the tire crossed the boundary marker he'd installed flush with the soil months earlier. His email went unanswered. By Friday, the fines had stacked into something heavier. The portal displayed a balance due, the number bolded, insistent. A red banner suggested prompt payment to avoid escalation. Mark closed the laptop and sat in the quiet house. He thought of bridges, of load calculations, of how stress distributed itself until it found a weak point. He had assumed the weak point was him. Outside, a car passed. The RV remained untouched. Diane's SUV was gone, leaving behind a scar in the lawn that would take weeks to heal. He stood and walked to the edge of the grass, toes at the boundary. He pressed his foot into the soil, testing the give. The ground yielded, then held. Mark looked up and down the street, at the houses lined up like well-behaved teeth. Somewhere behind closed doors, people watched and waited, measuring the cost of attention. He stepped back inside and locked the door, not out of fear, but habit. On the kitchen counter, his phone buzzed again. Another automated message, another resolved complaint. He silenced it and poured himself a glass of water, drinking it slowly. In the reflection of the darkened window, his face looked older than it felt, the lines deeper, the eyes sharper. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't about rules. It was about pressure, applied incrementally, invisibly, until resistance seemed unreasonable. Mark set the empty glass down and picked up a notebook he hadn't used in years. On the first page, he wrote the date. On the second, a list, names, times, measurements. Outside, the lawn lay quiet, the damage plain in the moonlight. He regarded it with the calm of someone who had finally identified the problem. And problems, he knew, had solutions. The records room smelled like dust and old paper, the kind of smell that settled into clothes and stayed there. Mark signed the log at the front desk with a pen tethered by a chain and followed the clerk down a narrow aisle lined with metal shelves. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering just enough to make the shadows seem restless. HOA archives are in the back, the clerk said, stopping beside a row marked Community ASSOCIATIONS. You can request copies at the desk. Originals don't leave the room. Mark nodded and thanked her. He slid a box free and carried it to the long table beneath the lights. The lid creaked when he opened it. Inside were binders, their spines labeled in neat block letters, minutes, correspondence, enforcement. Years ran down the sides like a timeline of someone else's life. He started with the minutes. The first binder opened easily. Meetings recorded with careful neutrality. Motions proposed, motions passed. Names repeated. Diane Kessler appeared often, her name paired with words like recommended, oversaw, coordinated. It wasn't unusual. Someone always took charge. What struck Mark was the consistency. Diane's recommendations were never amended, never deferred. He flipped to the next binder, and the next. Then the gaps appeared. 3 months missing in 2016, an entire year in 2018. The binders jumped forward, skipping stretches of time like a book missing chapters. He checked the shelf again, thinking he'd missed something. The labels confirmed it. Those records didn't exist here. Mark pulled out his phone and photographed the shelf, the empty spaces between years as telling as anything written. He turned to correspondence, letters printed on letterhead, emails transcribed and filed, complaints from homeowners about fines, about inspections, about cars towed overnight without warning. Diane's responses were always polite, always firm, always final. He noticed something else then, the signatures. Diane's name appeared on letters she wasn't listed as authoring. So did the board president, the treasurers, the secretary, different names, identical handwriting. The loops and slants matched too closely to be coincidence. Mark leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He closed his eyes and pictured the motion of a pen across paper, the muscle memory required to fake another person's signature convincingly. It wasn't impossible, it just required practice. He made notes, page numbers, dates. He didn't rush. Patterns revealed themselves only to patience. By mid-afternoon, he had filled 6 pages of his notebook. He returned the binders to their places and signed out. Outside, the sun pressed down with unrelenting confidence. He drove home in silence, letting the evidence arrange itself in his mind. That evening, he walked to Juniper Lane again. The widow Helen answered the door after the second knock. She looked tired, but less guarded than before. He held up his notebook like a peace offering. "I've been looking at records," he said. "I wanted to ask you something." She stepped aside, letting him in. They sat at the small kitchen table, the surface worn smooth by years of meals eaten quietly. Mark asked careful questions. When did the notices start? How often did inspections occur? Who signed the letters? Helen answered without embellishment. Dates, amounts, names. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder thick with paper, edges frayed from handling. Mark leafed through it, recognizing the phrasing, the tone. He stopped at a towing receipt. "Did they tow your car?" he asked. She nodded, 3 times, always overnight, same company. The name jumped out at him, Desert Shield Towing. He wrote it down. "Did Diane recommend them?" he asked. Helen hesitated. She said they were approved. Approved meant vetted. Approved meant money flowed somewhere. When Mark left, the sky had deepened into purple. He walked instead of driving, needing the movement. He passed houses with lights glowing softly inside, televisions flickering behind curtains. He wondered how many of those people knew what was happening and how many simply felt safer pretending it was. Back home, he searched Desert Shield Towing on his laptop. The company website was sparse. A phone number, a list of services, no names. He dug deeper, cross-referencing business registrations. The owner listed was a limited liability company with an address that matched a residential property 2 miles away. He recognized the last name. Diane's maiden name appeared in the filings, tucked into the paperwork like a footnote no one expected anyone to read. Brother-in-law. The connection wasn't illegal, not on its face. It was just another line in the web. Mark saved the documents and backed them up to a flash drive. He labeled it with the date and set it beside the notebook. At 9:30 p.m., headlights swept across the living room again. He didn't stand immediately. He watched from the couch as the light shifted, steady and deliberate. The engine idled. He counted. When the crunch came, it was louder than before, the sound of fresh soil surrendering. He stood and went to the window. The SUV sat deeper into the lawn now, the tire nearly touching the sprinkler head. Diane stepped out, glanced at the house, and adjusted the position by inches, aligning the tire with the edge of the grass as if using a ruler. Mark felt a flicker of something hot behind his ribs. He breathed until it cooled. He went outside, not to confront her, but to observe. He stood at the edge of the porch, arms loose at his sides. Diane didn't look at him this time. She took notes on a clipboard, her pen moving quickly. "You're damaging my property," he said. She didn't respond. He took photos, the angle, the tire, the boundary marker half buried beneath compressed soil. He zoomed in on the license plate, though he knew it by heart. When she finally looked up, her expression held no surprise. "You should stop antagonizing the board," she said. "I'm documenting." She smiled faintly. Documentation cuts both ways. She drove off, leaving the grass flattened and shining under the porch light. Mark knelt and touched the soil. It was compacted, dense, the way earth became when compressed beyond its tolerance. He pressed harder, feeling the resistance. He stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. Inside, he added the time to his notes. He drew a simple diagram of the lawn, marking where the tire had been each night. The pattern was unmistakable. Each placement was deliberate, incremental, testing how much pressure the ground and he could take before something gave. The next morning, a neighbor stopped him while he collected the mail. "You might want to be careful," the man said quietly, eyes darting toward the street. "Diane doesn't like pushback." "Neither do I," Mark replied. The neighbor nodded, a gesture of agreement without commitment. "She's been here a long time." "So have I," Mark said, though it wasn't entirely true. By noon, another violation notice arrived. This one cited unauthorized alteration of common area soil. Mark read it twice, then once more, savoring the absurdity. He forwarded it to himself, printed it, and added it to the growing stack on the kitchen table. He spent the afternoon on the phone with the city clerk's office, asking about zoning maps, enforcement oversight, complaint escalation. He kept his tone neutral, curious. The clerk offered information freely, unaware of how it might be used. There were procedures, she said. There were checks. HOAs operated with autonomy, but not immunity. Mark wrote it all down. That night, he didn't wait for the headlights. He went to bed early, setting his alarm for 4:00 a.m. He lay awake longer than he meant to, listening to the house settle, to the distant hum of traffic. When sleep finally came, it was light and dreamless. He woke before the alarm, the sense of readiness unfamiliar but welcome. He dressed quietly and stood at the window, watching the lawn in the pre-dawn light. The damage was plain, the tire impression crisp and undeniable. Mark smiled once, briefly. Patterns were only useful when someone knew how to read them. The email arrived at 7:03 a.m., a single line with no greeting. "Please see me privately before the next board meeting." It wasn't signed, but Mark recognized the address. The board secretary. He printed the message and folded it once, slipping it into his pocket as he poured coffee. Outside, the lawn lay bruised but quiet, the grass still flattened where the tire had rested. He resisted the urge to fix it. Evidence, he reminded himself, was fragile. They met at a coffee shop just outside the development, a place the HOA didn't use for meetings and therefore didn't officially exist. The secretary, Linda, sat at a corner table with her back to the wall, hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't touched. "Thank you for coming," she said quickly, as if the words were a debt she wanted off her books. "Thank you for asking," Mark replied. He didn't sit until she gestured to the chair across from her. She glanced around, then leaned forward. "I can't do this on the record." "I'm not recording," he said, patting his pockets. "I'm listening." She nodded, relief flashing across her face. "Your survey is accurate." Mark said nothing. "The strip of lawn is yours," she continued. "It always has been." "And the fines?" Her mouth tightened. "They shouldn't have been issued." "By mistake." She looked at him then, really looked, as if measuring how much truth he could absorb without breaking. "By instruction." Mark felt the words settle, heavy and precise. "Whose?" Linda hesitated. "You know." "I want to hear you say it." She swallowed. "Diane." He waited. "She controls the agenda," Linda said. "The enforcement pipeline, the vendor relationships, we vote," but she made a helpless motion with her hand. "It's not a real vote." "Why?" "Because if you don't go along, she finds something." Linda's voice dropped. "Everyone has something." Mark thought of the identical signatures, the missing records. "You've seen it happen." "Yes." "Then why are you still there?" Linda laughed softly, a sound without humor. "Because I like my house." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the espresso machine filling the gap. "There's a meeting tonight," Linda said finally. "Enforcement authorization. It's broader than usual. How broad? Foreclosure authority without additional board review. Mark nodded. He had expected as much. Will you object? Linda looked down at her hands. No. Will you speak? No. Will you vote yes? Her shoulders slumped. I won't vote no. It was the most she could offer. Mark stood. Thank you for your honesty. She reached out, touching his sleeve lightly. Be careful. He smiled, thin and polite. I am. That evening, the community room filled faster than usual. Word had spread, not openly, but through the small, efficient channels of suburban fear. Chairs scraped. Conversations stopped when Diane entered, her presence smoothing the room into order. Mark took his seat in the back, notebook in his lap. Pen resting against the page, he watched as the board members filed in, each one avoiding the other's eyes. Linda sat stiffly, hands folded, gaze fixed on the agenda. Diane opened the meeting with practiced ease, her voice calm, confident. She moved through routine items quickly, leaving no room for questions. When she reached enforcement authorization, she paused. This measure allows us to act decisively in cases of ongoing non-compliance, she said. It protects property values. A murmur of assent rippled through the room. Mark stood. Point of order, he said. Diane's eyes flicked to him, then away. Public comment is at the end. This affects my property, Mark said, directly. She sighed, the sound carefully calibrated. Very well, 2 minutes. He walked to the front, feeling the weight of the room press in. He held up his survey, then the photos, then the printed notices. These fines were issued for damage caused by a board member, he said. On my property, I have documentation. Diane smiled sympathetically. We've addressed this, Mark. You've erased it, he replied. The room shifted, a cough, a chair creaked. I'd like the board to acknowledge, Mark continued, that the strip of lawn in question is privately owned. Silence. Linda stared at the table. Diane clasped her hands. This is not the forum for disputes. It's the forum for votes, Mark said, and you're voting to take my house. That's inflammatory, Diane said gently. So is trespass, Mark replied. Diane's smile faded. Your time is up. The vote proceeded. Hands rose, some hesitated, none opposed. The motion passed. Mark returned to his seat, the pen leaving an indelible mark on the page as he pressed too hard. He closed the notebook carefully, as if the act itself required respect. Outside, the air was cool, the sky clear. He walked home instead of driving, letting the night steady him. As he turned onto his street, he saw the headlights waiting. Diane's SUV sat at the curb, angled toward his lawn like a predator poised to strike. The engine idled, patient. He stopped at the edge of his property and waited. The door opened. Diane stepped out, clipboard in hand. She didn't pretend this time. She walked straight to the lawn and guided the tire onto the grass, adjusting the angle with small movements until she was satisfied. Mark watched. She finished her notes and looked up. I warned you. You did, he said. You're making this difficult. I'm documenting, he replied. She laughed softly. You think that will save you? I think it will explain you. Her expression hardened. You should pay what you owe. I owe nothing. You owe compliance. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. This isn't personal. He met her gaze. It is now. She straightened, professionalism snapping back into place. Good night, Mark. She drove away, leaving the lawn crushed and shining under the porch light. Mark didn't move for a long moment. He listened to the hiss of the broken irrigation line, the sound of water escaping where it shouldn't. He felt the anger rise, then settle into something colder, more precise. Inside, he laid out the documents on the kitchen table, arranging them by date, by author, by consequence. He added Linda's admission to his notes, careful to mark it as off the record. He highlighted the vote authorization, the language broad enough to swallow a house whole. At midnight, an email arrived. Notice of intent to Leon. He read it once, then again. The tone was regretful. The deadline was firm. Mark closed the laptop and stood, stretching the stiffness from his back. He walked to the window and looked out at the lawn, at the place where care had once been enough. He understood now that the board knew, not in the abstract, not as rumor or suspicion, but in the way that mattered. They knew, and they had chosen silence because silence was safer. That knowledge steadied him. He turned off the lights and went to bed, setting his alarm earlier than usual. The night passed without dreams. When he woke, the house felt different, not threatened, but alert. Outside, the lawn waited, damaged but intact. So did he. Mark slept poorly but not restlessly. His mind moved with a steady, methodical rhythm, like a machine warming up. He woke before the alarm, the grey pre-dawn light pressing against the windows. For a moment, he lay still, listening. No engine, no crunch, just the house breathing around him. In the shower, hot water loosened the stiffness in his shoulders, and with it came memory, uninvited, precise. A bridge in Flagstaff, winter. The deck had shifted overnight, steel on concrete enough to jam a crawler crane in place. The operator had panicked, revving uselessly while the foreman shouted. Mark had crouched in the cold, fingers numb, watching how the tires bit into the gravel, how the weight transferred. He'd remembered something then, something old and inelegant. They hadn't touched the machine. They altered the ground. Expanding foam, industrial grade. Used wrong, it was a mess. Used right, it was physics doing what physics always did. Mark shut off the water and stood dripping, the memory vivid enough to smell diesel and wet earth. He wrapped a towel around his waist and stared at himself in the mirror. The man looking back seemed calmer than he felt, eyes steady, jaw set. "Don't be stupid," he said aloud. He dressed slowly, deliberately. Coffee tasted bitter, grounding. He carried the mug to the window and looked out at the lawn. The tire impression had hardened overnight, the edges crisp. He crouched and pressed his thumb into the soil beside it. The ground yielded, then resisted, compacted, predictable. He went inside and opened the drawer beneath the stairs, the one he hadn't touched since before his wife died. Old tools lay wrapped in cloth, labels in her handwriting still taped to the handles. He lifted them out carefully, setting them on the floor. A small drill, a length of tubing, measuring tape. He stopped, breathing through the tightness in his chest. This wasn't about revenge. He repeated that to himself until it sounded true. This was about leverage, exposure, ending a pattern without crossing a line he couldn't uncross. He sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. It wasn't long, dates, facts, attachments listed, a statement that everything he'd done had been nonviolent and within the letter of the law. He folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it to his attorney, a man he hadn't spoken to since settling his wife's estate. Mark placed the envelope in his bag. Insurance, he thought. Engineers believed in redundancy. Late morning, he drove to the first store. He parked 2 rows back, away from the entrance. Inside, the smell of lumber and fertilizer mingled in a way that always made him nostalgic. He picked up a can of expanding foam from the shelf, reading the label twice. He checked the nozzle, the pressure rating. He didn't buy anything else. At the register, the clerk scanned it without comment. Mark paid cash. The second store was across town. He bought gloves, a cheap tarp, Maury tubing, cash again. By the third stop, his nerves had settled into focus. He purchased nothing, just walked the aisles, checking stock, making mental notes. He left empty-handed. Back home, he laid everything out on the workbench in the garage, spacing the items evenly. He practiced attaching the tubing to the nozzle, timing how long it took for the foam to respond once depressed. He watched it expand, pale and insistent, filling the air, then hardening into something deceptively light. He cleaned everything meticulously, no residue, no mess. In the afternoon, he drove to the city clerk's office and sat in the waiting area with a number ticket folded between his fingers. When his turn came, he asked careful questions, hypothetical questions, about immobilized vehicles, about ground alteration, about intent. The clerk answered without suspicion. The law, she explained, concerned damage to property and obstruction of public ways. Soil was soil. Gravity was gravity. Mark thanked her and left. At home, he ate a sandwich without tasting it and watched the shadows lengthen across the lawn. He felt the familiar ache in his back, the reminder that his body was no longer something he could take for granted. He stretched and waited. At dusk, the phone rang, unknown number. "Mr. Ellison," a voice said, Diane's voice, calm, pleasant. "I wanted to give you a courtesy reminder. The lien process will begin tomorrow." "I received the notice," Mark said. "I'd hate for this to escalate," she continued. "So would I." "Then you understand what needs to happen." "Yes," he said, "I do." She paused, perhaps hearing something in his tone that hadn't been there before. "Good night, Mark." He didn't reply. When the headlights appeared later, he didn't go to the window. He stayed in the kitchen, listening. The engine idled. The crunch came, softer this time, the soil already tired. Mark checked his watch, 9:52 p.m. He waited until the lights went out in the house across the street. He waited until the neighborhood settled into its late-night quiet, the kind that magnified small sounds. He waited until the engine cut. Then he went to bed. The alarm rang at 4:30 a.m. He silenced it immediately and lay still, listening. Nothing. He dressed in the dark, pulling on gloves, slipping the envelope into his bag. He stepped outside and breathed in the cool air, the sky just beginning to pale. The SUV loomed at the curb, its bulk familiar now. The tire sat exactly where he expected, centered over the weakest point in the soil, the place he'd repaired twice already. Diane was consistent. Consistency was exploitable. Mark knelt, spreading the tarp beneath the grass, careful not to disturb the tire. He pushed the tubing into the soil at an angle, using a screwdriver to create space. He worked slowly, steadily, the way he always had. His hands knew what to do. He paused, heart thudding, and looked up and down the street. No movement, no lights. "Last chance," he whispered, not to the SUV, but to himself. He depressed the nozzle. The foam flowed, silent, obedient. He counted under his breath, monitoring resistance through the tubing, adjusting depth. He moved to the second insertion point, then the third. He didn't rush. Rushing made mistakes. When he finished, he withdrew the tubing and sealed the soil, smoothing the grass back into place. From above, nothing looked different. The ground beneath, however, had changed its mind about being flexible. Mark stood and wiped his hands on the tarp. He gathered his tools and stepped back, studying the scene. The SUV sat unchanged, smug in its stillness. He felt no triumph, just a quiet click, like something locking into place. Inside, he showered and dressed, placing the tools back where they belonged. He set the letter on the counter, ready. He poured coffee and sat at the table, watching the light grow. At 6:11 a.m., a shout broke the silence. Mark didn't move. He sipped his coffee and waited, listening as confusion turned to frustration as an engine revved uselessly. He heard a phone call placed, another received. He stood only when he heard the sirens in the distance, not police, but inspectors, the city's neutral blue and white vehicles pulling into the street. Mark picked up his bag and walked outside, his steps unhurried. The lawn was quiet, the SUV was not. He looked at the ground one last time, at the place where pressure had finally met resistance. Then he walked toward the sound of voices, ready to explain, not with anger, but with evidence. For the first time in weeks, the pattern had changed. Diane's voice carried down the street before Mark reached the curb. "This is unacceptable," she was saying, the word sharpened by volume rather than emotion. "I have meetings, I have obligations." The SUV sat exactly where she had left it, immaculate and immovable. The front tires were half swallowed by the lawn, the grass around them undisturbed enough to suggest intention rather than accident. A city inspector stood nearby, clipboard tucked under his arm, expression unreadable. Mark stopped a few paces away and waited. "I'm telling you," Diane continued, "this vehicle has been sabotaged." The inspector nodded politely. "We're not discussing the vehicle, ma'am, we're discussing the ground." Diane blinked. "The ground?" "Yes," he said, "specifically whether it constitutes common property or private land, and whether it's been subject to unauthorized alteration." She turned then, finally noticing Mark. Her eyes narrowed, calculating. "This is him," she said. "He's been hostile for weeks." Mark met her gaze. "Good morning, Diane." Her mouth tightened. "Did you do this?" "I didn't touch your car," he replied. The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Is that correct?" Mark nodded. "I didn't touch it." Another inspector approached, a woman with her hair pulled back tight, holding a rolled set of maps. "We've reviewed the survey submitted anonymously this morning," she said, unrolling it on the hood of her vehicle. "It indicates this strip of land is privately owned." Diane laughed, a sharp sound. "Anonymous submissions aren't admissible." "They are when they're corroborated," the woman replied, tapping the map. "And this one is." Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Curtains twitched. Phones emerged. Someone murmured Diane's name, the syllables tinged with curiosity rather than respect. "I demand this vehicle be freed immediately," Diane said. The male inspector shook his head. "At this point, it's a civil matter. We are here to assess potential violations." "What violations?" Diane snapped. "Repeated trespass," the woman said calmly, "and possibly harassment." Mark felt the word land like a stone dropped into still water. He said nothing. A police cruiser rolled up, lights off, parking at the end of the street. The officer stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. Diane pivoted toward him. "My car has been immobilized." The officer glanced at the SUV, then at the inspectors. "By what?" "By him," she said, pointing at Mark. The officer turned to Mark. "Sir." "I didn't touch her vehicle," Mark repeated. "I documented repeated trespass and property damage. City inspectors are here because someone requested an assessment." The officer nodded slowly. "Did you alter the ground?" Mark considered the question. "I maintained my property." The officer looked at the inspectors. They shrugged in unison. "Maintenance isn't a crime," the officer said, "unless it violates code." "And does it?" Diane demanded. The woman inspector consulted her clipboard. "Not as performed." Diane's composure cracked then, just slightly. "This is ridiculous." The crowd had grown to a dozen neighbors now, their murmurs forming a low, constant hum. Someone snapped a photo, another recorded video. "Ma'am," the officer said gently, "you might want to move your vehicle once it's able." Diane laughed again, brittle. "I can't." Silence fell, heavy and ripe with implication. A tow truck arrived, not Desert Shield, Mark noted, but a city-contracted service. The driver climbed out, surveyed the situation, and shook his head. "I can't pull it without risking damage," he said. "It's anchored." Diane stared at him. "Anchored?" "Ground solid," he replied, "like concrete." The inspector's pen paused mid-scratch. "Concrete?" "No," Mark said quietly, "soil." The woman inspector looked up sharply. "What kind of maintenance did you perform, Mr. Ellison?" He met her gaze, the kind that prevents further damage. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need to examine the area." They knelt, prodding the ground with tools, taking samples. Diane paced, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. Mark caught fragments. "Lawyer, unbelievable, now." An hour passed. The sun climbed. The street felt smaller, tighter, as if the houses themselves leaned in. Finally, the inspectors stood. "We'll be issuing a notice," the woman said, addressing Diane, "regarding repeated trespass and misuse of authority." Diane's face flushed. "Authority?" "Yes," the male inspector said. HOA authority does not supersede property law. The officer cleared his throat. At this point, there's no criminal charge, but I'd advise resolving this quickly. Diane rounded on Mark. You think this is over? He shook his head. No. Her phone rang again. She answered, listened, then laughed, too loud, too forced. You're joking, she said. She hung up and looked at the inspectors. The board is convening an emergency session. The woman inspector raised an eyebrow. We'll attend. That afternoon, the community room was packed. Diane sat at the front, her posture rigid. The board members flanked her, their expressions strained. Mark took a seat near the aisle, his notebook open. The inspectors stood to one side. The officer leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Diane began to speak, but the woman inspector interrupted. Before you do, we have questions. She listed them methodically: missing records, signature discrepancies, vendor relationships. Each item landed with dull finality. Diane tried to deflect, to reframe, but the words tangled. When the inspector mentioned Desert Shield towing, a murmur swept the room. That's my brother-in-law, Diane said sharply. The inspector nodded. We know. Silence. A board member cleared his throat. Diane, he said, not meeting her eyes, you didn't tell us that. She turned on him. You didn't ask. The inspector stepped forward. We'll be opening a formal investigation. The room erupted, voices overlapped, accusations flew. Mark watched, detached. As the structure he'd been pressed beneath began to collapse under its own weight. Diane stood abruptly. This is a witch hunt. The officer straightened. Ma'am. She stopped, breathing hard. Her eyes met Mark's across the room, and for a moment, something like fear flickered there. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Outside, the SUV still sat, a monument to overreach. Diane stood beside it now, arms crossed, her authority reduced to posture. Mark walked past her without stopping. Enjoy your lawn, she called after him. He paused and turned. I will. As he walked away, he felt the tension ease, replaced by something unfamiliar and fragile. Relief, perhaps, or simply the absence of pressure. That evening, the tow truck returned with different equipment. The SUV was lifted carefully, the ground beneath it torn and exposed. Mark watched from his porch as it was removed, the imprint left behind stark and undeniable. When the street finally emptied, he stepped onto the lawn. He knelt and pressed his palm into the soil. It was firm, unyielding, exactly as intended. He stood and looked around. Neighbors watched from windows and driveways, curiosity tempered by caution. No one spoke. Mark went inside and closed the door. The phone rang once, then again. He let it go to voicemail. He poured a glass of water and drank it slowly, savoring the quiet. Outside, the lawn lay scarred but free. The first resignation came before noon. Mark learned about it from a neighbor who knocked on his door with the cautious excitement of someone delivering news they weren't sure they were allowed to enjoy. The treasurer, it turned out, had stepped down for personal reasons, a phrase that hovered between confession and escape. By lunchtime, 2 more board members followed. Their names appeared in an email sent to the entire community, the language stiff, apologetic, studiously vague. Diane's name was absent. Mark read the email twice, then once more, noting what it didn't say. No denial, no reassurance, no assertion of control, just a promise that operations would continue during the review process. The review process was already eating its way through the neighborhood. City inspectors returned that afternoon, this time with clipboards joined by legal pads and small recorders. They moved house to house, not knocking everywhere, but enough to signal intent. Mark watched from his window as they spoke with Helen on Juniper Lane, then with the man who owned the RV. The RV was sighted within minutes, a bright orange notice slapped onto the windshield like a brand. That evening, Mark's phone rang again. This time he answered. Mr. Ellison, the voice said, Diane's voice stripped now of warmth, sharpened by urgency. We need to talk. I'm listening, Mark said. Privately, "You've had weeks," he replied. "You chose public." A pause. He could hear her breathing, controlled but uneven. "You don't understand what you've started." "I understand patterns," Mark said, "and consequences." She lowered her voice. "If you withdraw your complaints, I can make this go away." Mark smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. "You already tried." "You think the inspectors are on your side," she pressed. "They're not your friends." "I know," he said. "They're doing their jobs." She exhaled sharply. "You're making a mistake." "No," Mark said gently. "I stopped making one." He ended the call before she could respond. The next day, the subpoenas began. They arrived quietly, delivered by certified mail, envelopes thick and impersonal. Mark received one too, not as a target, but as a witness. He read it at the kitchen table, the language precise, unemotional. Requested documents, requested testimony. He gathered his materials without hesitation. Across the community, panic spread in small, controlled bursts. Conversations cut short when others approached. Lawn work paused mid-motion. Diane's allies, those who had once nodded along in meetings, suddenly found reasons to be unavailable. At an emergency HOA meeting convened without Diane's name on the agenda, the remaining board members sat like students awaiting discipline. Mark attended, sitting near the back, observing. The interim chair, a man who had once let Diane speak over him without protest, cleared his throat repeatedly before managing a sentence. "We are cooperating fully," he said. "We regret any discomfort experienced by residents." No one applauded. When public comment opened, Helen stood. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. She described the fines, the letters, the towings. She named amounts, dates, consequences. Others followed, stories layered atop stories, each one filling in a gap Mark had already mapped. Diane wasn't there to contradict them. Outside, reporters arrived, drawn by tips and the irresistible optics of suburban order unraveling. Cameras lingered on the damaged lawn, on the orange notices, on the closed HOA office with its tasteful serif font. Mark declined interviews. He stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, watching the story move beyond him. By Friday, Diane broke. She appeared at the city offices with an attorney, posture stiff, expression controlled. Mark wasn't there, but he learned later from the inspectors how it had gone. She denied wrongdoing at first, framing her actions as enforcement zeal. When presented with signatures, with financial ties, with timestamps she couldn't explain, her story shifted. Others were involved, she said. She had been pressured. She had been protecting the community. The inspectors listened, unmoved. By the end of the day, she was cooperating. Emails surfaced, notebooks, bank records. The tow company's invoices revealed a neat pattern of referrals and rebates. The missing HOA records reappeared in part, recovered from personal devices and cloud accounts. Each revelation stripped away another layer of authority, leaving something small and desperate beneath. The board dissolved officially the following week. A temporary administrator was appointed by the city, her first act to freeze all enforcement actions and suspend outstanding fines. Mark received the notice in the mail, the words clear and final. His balance was zeroed, the lien notice voided. He placed the letter in his notebook, closed it, and set it on the shelf. The SUV became an artifact. It sat impounded at a municipal lot, photos of its half-sunken tires circulating online, accompanied by captions that ranged from amused to outraged. Mark avoided reading the comments. The image said enough on its own. Diane, meanwhile, was charged civilly, not criminally, not yet, but enough to begin dismantling the illusion she'd built. Lawsuits followed, filed by residents who had lost homes, paid fines, endured pressure they hadn't known how to name at the time. Mark attended one hearing, sitting quietly in the back. Diane sat at the defendant's table, her hair pulled back too tightly, her hands folded with deliberate care. When she noticed him, her eyes flicked away almost immediately. There was no satisfaction in it, only a sense of something closing. On a Tuesday morning, Mark received a call from the city surveyor. "We've completed our review," the surveyor said. "The HOA trespassed onto your property repeatedly over several years." "I know," Mark replied. "We'll be issuing a formal finding," the man continued. "You're entitled to compensation for damages." Mark considered this. The lawn, the irrigation, the weeks of pressure. "I'm more interested in the record," he said. "That will be public," the surveyor assured him. "That's enough." When he hung up, Mark stepped outside. The lawn still bore scars, patches of grass slow to recover. He knelt and began pulling loose blades, his movements unhurried. The sun was warm on his back. A neighbor approached, tentative. "You did good," the man said. Mark nodded. "I did what was necessary." The neighbor hesitated. "They're asking if you'll join the new board." Mark smiled. "No." That afternoon, he reseeded the damaged area, spreading the mix evenly, his hands steady. He placed discreet boundary stones along the edge of the property, flush with the soil, visible only to those who knew what to look for. When he finished, he stood and surveyed the work. It would take time to heal. That was fine. As evening fell, a car parked on the street across from his house, carefully aligned with the curb. The driver glanced at the lawn, then adjusted slightly, leaving a respectful gap. Mark watched from his porch, a glass of water in his hand. He felt the quiet settle around him, not the brittle quiet of suppression, but the honest kind that followed resolution. The pattern had been broken, not by force, but by exposure. He turned off the porch light and went inside, closing the door softly behind him. The first rain of the season came without warning. Mark stood at the kitchen window and watched it darken the soil, the drops small at first, then insistent. The lawn absorbed the water unevenly where the damage had been, the reseeded patches turning a deeper shade of green more quickly than the rest. Healing was never uniform. It happened where it was allowed. The new boundary stones held firm, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. Mark liked that. They weren't a challenge or a warning. They were simply facts made visible. Across the street, a moving truck idled, its white sides glaring against the muted colors of the houses. The HOA administrator, temporary, efficient, and conspicuously unaffiliated, supervised as boxes were unloaded from the former board office. File cabinets, computers, binders thick with the residue of authority. The administrator checked each item off a list, methodical and unsentimental. Mark sipped his coffee and felt the heat spread through his chest. His doctor would have disapproved of the caffeine, but the doctor wasn't here to see the way the morning light broke across the lawn, the way order had returned without ceremony. His phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. He let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Ellison," a woman said, "this is Sandra Howell. I've been appointed interim president of the Community Association." "I know," Mark replied. He'd seen her at work already, quiet, competent, immune to theatrics. "I won't take much of your time," she said. "I wanted to personally confirm that all actions against your property have been rescinded, fines voided, records corrected." "Thank you," Mark said. "There's also the matter of restitution," she continued. "The association will cover repairs." "I've handled them," Mark said. "What I need is assurance." She didn't hesitate. "You have it. We are implementing oversight, third-party audits, no unilateral enforcement." "And parking?" Mark asked. A faint smile crept into her voice. "Street only, no exceptions." "That's enough," he said. She paused. "The board would benefit from someone with your experience." "I'm not interested," Mark said gently. "I expected that," she replied, "but I had to ask." When the call ended, Mark set the phone down and went outside. The rain had slowed to a mist, the air cool and clean. He knelt at the edge of the lawn and pressed his fingers into the soil. It gave, then held, balanced between softness and strength. He thought of Diane then, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity. She had been intelligent, careful, dangerous precisely because she believed herself justified. Mark had seen that before in his career, the way systems failed not from stupidity, but from certainty. He'd heard through the neighborhood channels that she was no longer in her house. Temporary housing, someone said, that her attorney had advised silence, that she spent long days waiting for hearings, for outcomes, for control to return in some form. Mark doubted it would. Later that week, a thick envelope arrived from the city. Inside were formal findings, printed on heavy paper. The language was restrained, the conclusions unambiguous. Repeated trespass, abuse of authority, failure of oversight. Mark read it once, then placed it in the drawer beneath the stairs, beside the tools and the memories. Some things didn't need to be revisited often. On Saturday morning, he drove to the nursery and bought a young mesquite tree. The attendant helped him load it into the truck, asking where it would be planted. "Front yard," Mark said. The man nodded approvingly. Good shade in a few years. At home, Mark dug the hole himself, measuring depth, checking alignment. He worked slowly, his back complaining but holding. When the tree was set, he stepped back and considered it. The mesquite was small but stubborn by nature. It would grow where it was planted, roots finding purchase even in unforgiving ground. As he filled the hole, a familiar SUV passed down the street, not Diane's but similar. It slowed near his house, then continued without stopping. Mark watched it go, feeling nothing more than mild interest. That afternoon, Helen from Juniper Lane stopped by with a pie she'd bought rather than baked. She apologized for that, unnecessarily. "I got a letter," she said, sitting at the kitchen table. "They're reviewing my case." "They should," Mark replied. She stuttered him. "You didn't have to do what you did." He smiled faintly. "I know." When she left, the house felt fuller, as if conversation itself had weight. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood adjusted. Meetings were shorter, notices fewer. The RV disappeared. Cars parked carefully, tires aligned with curbs, as if the asphalt itself demanded respect. Mark fell into a new routine: morning walks, coffee on the porch, occasional waves exchanged with neighbors who had learned, belatedly, how fragile peace could be when built on silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the houses in amber, Mark received one final call. It was Diane. He considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered. "Yes," he said. Her voice sounded different, tired, stripped of polish. "I wanted to tell you I'm resigning." "I know," Mark said. "They're using everything against me," she continued, "things that were standard practice." "They weren't," he replied. A pause. "You could have ruined me," she said. "I didn't," Mark said. "You did." She exhaled, a sound that carried resignation rather than anger. "You think you're better than me." "I think systems matter," he said, "and so do limits." She laughed softly, without humor. "Enjoy your lawn." "I will," Mark said. She hung up. Mark stood in the doorway for a long moment after the call ended, listening to the quiet hum of the house. He felt no victory, no sense of having won something, only the steady satisfaction of having stopped something from continuing. That night rain fell again, heavier this time. Mark watched from the porch as water pooled briefly, then drained as it should. The irrigation system held. The soil stayed put. Across the street, the moving truck was gone. The former HOA office sat dark, its windows reflecting the streetlights without comment. Mark turned off the porch light and stepped inside, closing the door with deliberate care. He set his alarm for the morning, not early, not late, just enough. Outside, the lawn rested, marked but intact. And for the first time since he'd moved in, Mark slept without listening for engines, without bracing for the sound of tires biting into ground that deserved better. The grass would grow back. So would he.